Support comes from Mosby Building Arts. Sometimes the smaller home projects make the biggest difference. Mosby creates custom spaces that help you love your home even more. For projects big and small, visit callmosby.com.
This is St. Louis on the Air from St. Louis Public Radio. I'm Elaine Cha. In 2022, St. Louis native Julia Rue found herself somewhere she'd never dreamed she'd be, going viral on TikTok. And she did so with this song called Dive.
All of the waves in the world can't rock me. I'm on a mission in G. Just watch me go. Dive. All that's left is the dive. Don't forget to close your eyes and hold your breath. Ready, set. Take the dive.
Dive, which Rue wrote and sang herself, had a purpose spelled out clearly in the caption that went with the song. There was no Korean Disney princess, so I decided to make my own, happy face. Today, that TikTok post has had 1.3 million views. It led to a partnership with South Korean conglomerate LG, one of the country's biggest multinational companies, and an animation that 4.9 million people on TikTok have watched. Just a few months ago, Rue published Shimjang Takes the Dive, her second book. It's a middle grades novel that tells the story of a 12-year-old girl who looks a lot like the Korean Disney princess in Rue's viral video from 2022. The protagonist's journey takes her through another world that helps her understand who she is and what she's been missing. It's an adventure that begins and ends with a plunge into waters unknown. Julia Rue joins us from her home in New York to talk about her latest novel, as well as the dives she's taken herself, which includes leaving her hometown to get where she is today. Julia, welcome to St. Louis on the Air.
Hi, thank you so much for having me.
So Julia, you are a first-generation St. Louisan and a third-generation, or by other accounts, 2.5 generation Korean American. What was it like to grow up here in STL?
Yeah, that's right. I am 2.5 generation Korean, although I think some people have different definitions of what the generations mean. My dad was born in Seoul, and then he grew up in Ohio, and my mom was born in New York, and then I was born in St. Louis. I love St. Louis. I feel so nostalgic for my hometown every time I'm back there. It brings up really, really wonderful memories. I went to Forsyth School for elementary school, and then I went to John Burroughs in high school. And I think during those times, I got to experience so many wonderfully vibrant artistic experiences, from doing the school plays to creative writing in class to even when I was on the playground, I used to direct my friends in these sort of musicals that I would make up in elementary school. And then in high school, I got the opportunity to showcase a musical that I had written with my brother. And so I think so many of these early artistic experiences were really fundamental to my journey overall as an artist and becoming an artist for my career, although I really didn't anticipate that I would ultimately be doing this as a career. It was always a dream of mine growing up, and I just feel really lucky to have had the ability to nurture that those hobbies.
Mm-hmm. What was it that made what you're doing now not part of the reality you imagined for yourself?
I think for me growing up, there were a couple factors at play. One of the main ones is I didn't come from a family of artists. My mother was in banking, and my dad is a doctor, and a lot of my family members are doctors. And I think growing up in St. Louis, far from the coasts, we don't see as many professional artists. And I think in my mind, I had a certain idea of what it meant to be a professional artist and what it meant to be sort of a starving artist. And that to me felt like a whole fictional world. But on top of that, I think growing up in St. Louis, especially sort of, I can't believe 20 years ago, the landscape of representation in the arts looked really, really different from how it does now and how I'm sure it will continue to look in the future. When I was growing up, it was very, very rare to see a movie or a TV show or anything on screen centering an Asian American person. Especially, I think, in the theater, it's still, even today, we are very underrepresented. And musical theater being my main passion and my main the thing that I loved the most, and composing and writing songs. When I was growing up, I think I often think about the fact that from 4 to 18, I played violin through Suzuki, and I did the community music school orchestras, and I played an orchestra at school and chamber music. And in all of that time, there was not a single female composer that I played, that I was given the repertoire of. And the first time I ever played music by a female composer was music that I had composed myself when I was 12, or I guess starting when I was around 7 or 8, but in a sort of performance setting when I was 12. And so I think the lack of Asian American representation on top of the lack of female representation in behind the scenes world of music sort of made me feel like, well, if it's never been done before, how could it even be possible? And then I think going into college, I really didn't know what it meant to be an artist. There was no person or role model that I could look to and say, that person looks like me and is doing the dream that I have. And so I think for a long time, it really kind of felt just like a fantasy or maybe a hobby.
2022, that year you were a senior in college, is that right?
Yeah, that's correct.
So how was it that you started on what people would experience through that viral video in 2022 and Dive?
Yeah, so the project of Dive actually goes back a long way. For a really long time, as soon as I started writing musicals, one of the first musical projects I ever did was actually a Disney parody that I wrote when I was 15. And I always have taken a lot of inspiration from Disney in that, to me, they really capture the heart and humor of and the family sort of feeling that I think of so fondly when I think of the things that I was watching and experiencing when I fell in love with musical theater. What I love about Disney is that it's really accessible. So for someone who has never seen a Broadway musical or might not even be able to ever see a stage musical, they probably have seen or at least heard of the songs in a Disney musical. And so growing up, I had this dream that maybe one day I would create the Korean Disney princess, or one day I would write for Disney. And then in 2019, after I had gotten my first professional production at the American Repertory Theater, I had adapted this folktale, Thumbelina, and the next year I had adapted Jack and the Beanstalk, and a lot of my work was folktale adaptation. And my now fiance, my then boyfriend, saw Thumbelina, and he said, there's a Korean folktale called Shimcheong that you should adapt. and that was, I think, back in 2019. I sort of had it in the back of my mind. And then when it was time to write my senior thesis at Harvard, at that time I had recently switched over from being pre-med and had committed to pursuing a career in the arts, and that's a whole other long story. But I decided I had originally been working on a different project when the pandemic hit, and my grandpa got COVID and he actually passed away. And my grandmother moved in with my family, and for the first time I was spending a lot of time with her, hearing about her stories in Korea. I had just started taking Korean classes at Harvard, and I realized that I was a little bit distanced from my heritage in a way that I didn't want to be, and I wanted to unite my art with my culture in order to figure out who I was and also to maybe make a difference in terms of Korean representation in the arts, especially Korean American representation. Mm-hmm. So that's what led me in the very first place to dig up that idea, to take Shimcheong idea off the shelf. I started writing the show in 2020, switched that to my senior thesis topic, and I actually had the idea to post that video on TikTok in 2020, and I wrote the idea down, and then I kept it a secret for 2 years while I worked on the show, because I didn't want, to get the outside to get the internet, to get the internet's opinions too much into my head while I was writing the show. And then 2 years later, I finally finished a draft of the show, and it was ready to post. And so it was a really long time from the first striking of the idea to the time that I actually posted that video. And I'm actually still working on that project now today. But yeah, it's been a delightful few years.
Was there anything about the response to that TikTok video that surprised you, or that stays very clear in your mind or your heart?
Absolutely. I mean, honestly, every single part of it, I still think back with so much joy when I think back to that month and even the year following that video that I posted. I was someone who was not really accustomed to posting myself on social media. It was the first video that I posted on TikTok. I actually didn't even have TikTok on my phone. I downloaded it and then I created that video, and I consulted a few friends and posted it. And although I had this 2-year-long dream and plan of, okay, maybe I'll post this thing and maybe it'll go viral and people will see it, and maybe this will be the thing that allows me to launch my career after graduation, I never anticipated that it would actually come to fruition to the degree that it did. I think one of the biggest challenges for me while writing Shimcheong was figuring out my own cultural identity as someone who is a 2.5 generation Korean, who didn't grow up speaking Korean at home and celebrating Korean traditions, to be trying to write this folktale and realizing just how little I knew about Korea and Korean music traditions and Korean folktale traditions, and doing all of this research. I really struggled to understand. There were a lot of points where I said, am I the right person to be telling this story at all? And then questioning myself, well, who's even going to see it anyway? And I think those were questions I was dealing with my entire life. I think a lot of Midwestern Asian Americans have this experience of growing up in predominantly not Asian places and then going to college maybe, or immersing themselves in adulthood in Asian culture, and realizing just how going from being the Asian person in the room to being the least culturally Asian person in a room full of Asians. And so I think then that was an experience that I definitely had. And then being so warmly received from Asian people all over the world, whether they were in Korea or in America, and even people I did some interviews in France, or like with a French news station, or with an Indian newspaper, and just seeing the reception all around the world. It was honestly it felt just like a warm hug and a realization that there is no right way to be Asian American. And when you tell your own true story that resonates with you, that is what resonates with other people. And so I think it was just such a momentous time in my life that I'll always look back on really, really fondly.
I'm talking with St. Louis native Julia Rue. Her most recently published book is titled Shimcheong Takes the Dive. This is a middle grades novel that was published in April this year. We need to take a quick break, but we'll be back shortly to continue this conversation. This is St. Louis on the Air on St. Louis Public Radio. Welcome back. I'm Elaine Cha. I'm talking with St. Louis native Julia Rue. Her most recent book is a middle grades novel called Shimcheong Takes the Dive. The book traces back to a musical she wrote her senior year in college at Harvard University, and a TikTok video of a Korean Disney princess from that musical that went viral in 2022. Before we go any further, Julia, tell us about the folktale of Shimcheong and what it is about this particular story that resonated with you.
To me, I knew immediately when I read the original story of Shimcheong that it was going to be the story that I adapted when I was searching for this concept, this sort of Korean Disney princess thing that I wanted to make. I think what really stood out to me were two things. The first one is that it is a rare folktale from an ancient time about a young woman who goes on an adventure. A lot of ancient Korean folktales center animals or they center men, and I really wanted this to be a story about a young woman. And then in addition to that, it's a story about homecoming and a girl who is searching for her home, trying to get back home and reconnect with her family. And as someone who had just lost my grandfather at the time and someone who was trying to reconnect with my culture, those two things really stood out to me. And so I love that story.
Mm-hmm. Reconnecting with culture, you described yourself as being, depending on whose sort of scale we're looking at, as either 2.5 generation or third generation. But the fact is that you did not grow up with Korean language here in St. Louis. And you have talked about losing your grandfather during the pandemic and then your grandmother coming to live with you. What was it about the stories that you heard from them that led you to your first novel, which you co-wrote with your brother, Brad? And how did that set you up to write Shimcheong, which is for a very different age group?
Absolutely. I think growing up with my grandparents living in St. Louis, just 10 minutes away from us, that was such a blessing. When my parents would go out of town, we would stay with our grandparents, and they would always tell these amazing stories about growing up in Korea. And when I say amazing, I don't mean it was necessarily all sunshine and rainbows, but it were these fantastic stories that to us as children in America felt fantastical. My grandparents grew up during the Japanese occupation of Korea. They also lived through the Korean War. They had a forbidden romance because my grandmother was rich and my grandpa was poor, and they had met in church, and that was very taboo back then. And they had this secret romance that carried on through their teens while my grandfather was also in a secret underground revolutionary group against the Japanese Empire. And so hearing their stories about that time, my brother and I are both storytellers, and we always knew that we wanted to write something about their lives. We just didn't know what form it would take. And actually, over the pandemic, right around that same time that I was writing Shimcheong, aka Dive, I had gotten really back into reading fantasy novels, which is what I first fell in love with reading when I was a child. And I said to my brother, hey, why don't we write a YA fantasy novel inspired by Grandma and Grandpa's story? And he said, let's do it. And so we started writing that novel also, I think in either 2020 or 2021. And we were working on that story for several years until fast forward later, the book came out last summer. But I think that was the time that I fell back in love with writing prose. I had first become a storyteller through writing prose when I was a child. I loved writing stories, and I loved writing short little chapter books, and I wrote a lot of fan fiction when I was a tween. And then when I started writing music and started writing musicals, I sort of took a break from it, and I was writing a lot of theater. And so that opportunity during the pandemic to get back into my roots of writing sort of these long form stories really was a homecoming in and of itself. And then fast forward to after Dive went viral, I was meeting with my new team of agents because I got signed from that. Actually, my mentor from the American Repertory Theater introduced me to my agent, who also did the same internship that I did when I was in college, but 10 years before me. And with my new team of agents, I was sharing all the different projects I had. I was sharing about The Last Tiger, this book that I had written with my brother. And then my literary agent had the idea of, well, how about we consider adapting your musical into a middle grade novel? And it was the first book that I wrote completely by myself. And at first, it was a really daunting prospect, but ultimately, after having gone through the first process of writing and publishing The Last Tiger, I brought a lot more confidence into the process of writing Shim Chung Takes the Dive. And I think I learn more and more I learned from reading and I learned from writing. And I think I've learned a lot through writing both of those books. And I'm really excited. Brad and I have another novel coming out next year. And I think we really took some of these lessons that we learned when we wrote those first, in writing those first two books to our third novel as well.
Mm-hmm. There is quite a bit of musicality in Shim Chung Takes a Dive. So it is interesting to hear about the order of operations, as it were, like going from a musical to a book. Was there something about doing so for middle grades that felt just right in some way, especially given sort of the development that you've described of your writing, of your love of musicals, of writing your own pieces?
For me, I think one of the joys of getting to write in a lot of different mediums is that you get to explore a lot of different parts of your creative brain. And so actually, when I approached the middle grade novel, I approached it quite differently than I did writing the musical. Although the story takes on really kind of the same framework and is inspired by the same folktale, in my mind, the audience that is going to be consuming a middle grade novel is consuming it very differently than an audience would consume a musical, a stage musical in front of them. And also the audience who is consuming it might be a different age group. And so the voice of the middle grade novel, it was really, really fun to take my theatrical experience into developing all the voices of these characters in the book. That includes the dialogue, but it also includes Shim Chung's own voice, her speaking voice. And I really thought of it as writing kind of an extended monologue in this child's voice. In terms of the crafting of it, I think the main sort of difference when people ask me, what is the difference between the middle grade novel and the musical? I would say the tone is very different in that the middle grade novel, it was really important for me to be funny and action-packed and to feel almost like a modern kid, a kid that would be reading it today. I want them to connect with the character in a little bit of a different way that someone might connect with someone they're watching on stage. So I often say if the musical feels like the Korean Disney princess, the book probably feels a little bit more like a Korean Percy Jackson in that it's kind of modern and funny and action-packed. And the story itself has been a little bit modernized, although all the folklore is still in there, just so that it can connect a little bit more easily with middle grade readers without having to dumb any of it down. I want to treat my readers like they're smart, but give them a voice that I feel like they'll connect with.
One of the things I noticed, Julia, is that your book uses Korean terms with some descriptions, but doesn't translate. So, for instance, Hanok is described as a small house with a thatched roof, so there's accessible imagery. And then you write red hot ojingo 볶음 without explaining what the ojingo 볶음 is. And then, you use the term 귀신 instead of ghost or spirit. What guided that decision? Were they ones that you had to make a case for?
So I love that my publisher actually really allowed me to explore my own culture in kind of whatever way I wanted to in the book. For me, the reason that I did it that way, I mean, there's a couple of reasons. Number one, I'm someone who learned Korean entirely as a second language in college. And for me, a lot of the ways that I have picked up all of my new Korean is through context, sort of in context of conversations, hearing the words that I don't know, and learning or figuring out based on the context cues what those words are. And I tried really hard in the book to, every time there was a word in Korean, to at least provide enough context cues that people could sort of figure out based on the book who that person was, or what that food was, or what that word or that phrase might mean. Although I do also know that when I was growing up, a great way for me to learn new words was by reading and then looking up the words that I didn't understand. And I know that kids have they have a lot of access to the internet, maybe sometimes too much, but I know that if a kid is curious and wants to learn what a word means, they might look up that word. They might be able to see a picture of that thing. And to me, that is sort of its own interesting intellectual experience. And so rather than sort of spoon feed what every word meant, I thought it might be fun to integrate the words in the same way that I might have learned them.
Mm-hmm. And I think that acknowledges how smart your readers are. Not only kids, but for adults who are reading this book with their their child, with a niece or a nephew, or just a small person that is in their lives. You've talked about representation a number of times. What does that word mean to you, Julia? And what might it have meant to Julia growing up in St. Louis in the 2000s?
To me, representation is so important because when we are young, especially for young people, and that's why a lot of my work focuses on young people, or is meant for young people, because that's the age that we are building our understanding of the world and our understanding of what is possible and also what we are allowed to imagine. And so when I was a kid, for any kid, if they never see anybody who looks like them or who they can relate to doing something that they want to be doing or that they dream of, how can they believe that it's even possible? So for me, it's a lot of almost like seeing is believing. If we see something is possible, it opens up our mind about what we can even imagine beyond that. And so that's why I've sort of dedicated my entire career to working on increasing representation, and we're seeing a lot of the amazing changes that are happening right now, but we still have a long way to go, especially in the live theater industry. And I think it's something that all we can do is keep working towards telling more stories and different kinds of stories. You can never represent everyone in a single story, but you can tell your own story, and that might connect with someone out there who hasn't seen their reflection yet on a stage or on screen. So that's what I find really important about representation.
Is there anything that you've heard from readers about what your work has meant to them?
To me, the feedback that I love the most from readers, I've recently, after Shim Chung Takes the Dive came out, I had a lot of parents just send me either photos of their kids absorbed in the book or videos of their children talking about how much they enjoyed that story. And for me, growing up, there were no stories like that when I was that age, 8 to 12. And so to be able to see these kids with their faces absorbed in a book, it's really inspiring. I think especially today, where it's so easy to reach for the iPad and it's so easy to just watch a screen. I think it's really important to build. Reading is just so important for building imagination and working a different part of your brain. And so to be able to give some people an experience where they maybe see their story in some way reflected on a page, and also just the intellectual experience of reading a book for kids, it's really, really inspiring.
Mm-hmm. There was the question that I asked about what Julia in 2000's St. Louis would have appreciated. But I had the opportunity to meet you actually last year when you came to the Schlafly branch of the St. Louis Public Library for a conversation that was in partnership with the Very Asian Foundation. And it was very interesting to me to see that there were many people there who are not of Korean extraction or even of East Asian background. What do you think that says about the mainstream hunger for the kinds of stories you are telling?
It's funny. I actually also noticed this when my brother and I did our first book festival. We found that the majority of our readers were not necessarily Korean American teenagers, but adults of all ethnic backgrounds. And I think it shows there is a hunger for diverse stories. People are excited to read about and watch stories about people that are different from them. And I think that's really, really important, especially right now in a time where a lot of our social media feeds are engineered to revolve around our own interests and to revolve around our own identities. It's an interesting time where we really do need to be building these sort of pathways of empathy. And I think it's really, really inspiring to see that there are a lot of people seeking that out. I think it's kind of interesting now as well. Previously, because of the barrier to entry to be able to make a movie, to be able to make a book, representation moved a lot more slowly. And now, because anyone with a phone can upload a video and post their own story online, I think that young people are growing up seeing so many more different kinds of stories and different kinds of faces, and in a lot of ways are more accustomed to that. So there's sort of both ends of social media has this curated algorithm, but also it's so much more accessible for new storytellers. So I'm kind of excited to see what that means for the future of storytelling and diversity. I think only time will tell.
Mm-hmm. Julia, your family has moved to the East Coast since you left for college, but you've been back to St. Louis a number of times over the last several years and done so with the art that you've created. Have you walked around the block here where the fabulous Fox Theater is and imagined what it would be like to have your work presented there?
I actually haven't been back to the Fox in a long time, but I always think about that. My family would go see the shows when I was growing up, when, these touring shows. I remember we saw Mamma Mia there, we saw Wicked there, and I also often think about the Muni. I loved going to the Muni at St. Louis, in Forest Park, when I was growing up, and I absolutely, all the time, one of my favorite things to do when I write a new show is to envision the different places that it could go up in. One of my musicals, Endless, is a romantasy musical about stars, kind of envisioning the stars as these mythological gods and goddesses. And I've often thought about, wow, what would it be like to have that at the Muni, where it's truly an open air theater and you can see the sky and then you see these stars come down. So absolutely. I love being back in St. Louis, and John Burroughs put on one of my children's musicals with the middle school 2 years ago, and that was so delightful. So it's always such a joy to come back.
So I understand that you and your brother Brad, with whom you co-wrote The Last Tiger, that you're working on a new YA fantasy book, and it has a very specific connection to St. Louis. What is that?
Yeah, so my brother and I are working on our newest novel. It's sort of a YA sci-fi fantasy. Current working title is Free Wilma. It'll be out next summer. And it's about a girl from St. Louis, Missouri, and she is Korean American. And a lot of that story is actually inspired by my brother's experience with it's called ME/CFS. It's an illness that he's had for the last 6 years. Also known, it developed after he had long COVID. And it's basically chronic fatigue. And it's about this girl who has had this experience with chronic fatigue. And while she's sick, she is only able to read this one science fiction novel over and over again because of how much brain fog and how much brain fog and fatigue she has. And then one day she wakes up on page 1 of the book in the body of the protagonist with none of the protagonist's survival skills, and essentially has to figure out how to tell her own story. And survive this deadly sci-fi world. So that's the book that we're working on right now, and it'll be coming out next summer. There are a lot of fun St. Louis references in it. There are some references to certain St. Louis schools. There's references to Creve Coeur Lake and other St. Louis landmarks in the book. So I am really excited to return home with that one.
Composer and author Julia Rue is a St. Louis native now based in New York. Her most recently published book is titled Shimjang Takes the Dive.
This episode was produced by Elaine Shaw. Audio editing by Lila Halabashich.
Our audio engineer is Aaron Dorr. This podcast was mixed and edited by Aaron.
Our executive producer is Alex Hoyer.
St. Louis on the Air is a production of St. Louis Public Radio. Understanding starts here.
Do you find yourself regularly listening to episodes of St. Louis on the Air? Suggest us to a friend you think might enjoy our conversations. And leave us a review and rating on Apple Podcasts on the App Store. It's the simplest way to help people discover our show. Thanks.
St. Louis Public Radio is a member-supported service of the University of Missouri St. Louis.
Hi, I'm Laura Hamden, and my colleague Jessica Rogan and I are your daily hosts of the Gateway newsletter. We meet with the editors in the STLPR newsroom every weekday to bring you the top local stories of the day in a quick and easy 6-minute read by 6 a.m. In an age of overwhelm, it's a refreshing, thoughtful take on the news day, if we do say so ourselves. Fine-tune your daily news habit with the Gateway newsletter. Subscribe at stlpr.org/gateway.